Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to explore a really fascinating aspect of human nature. We're looking at how, and more importantly, why humanity constantly tries to predict the future of telecommunications. From the moment the very first wires were strung up on poles, all the way to the invisible, hyper-fast networks of tomorrow, we've just never been able to stop guessing what's next. But why do we do it? What actually drives this endless cycle of technological prophecy? Well, we're going to examine the history of these predictions, look at those incredible moments when the experts were dead wrong, the eerie times they were totally spot on, and ultimately discover why mapping out the future is a fundamental part of actually building it.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to start with one of the most famously dismissive quotes in all of tech history. So, back in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell offered to sell his brand new telephone patent to the telegraph giant Western Union for $100,000. Now, while this exact quote is considered by a lot of historians to be apocryphal, it absolutely perfectly captures the sentiment of the era. This supposed committee basically called the telephone an ungainly and impractical device. They completely dismissed it as hardly more than a toy. They literally couldn't fathom why anyone would want voice communication when they could just send a nice, clear written message via a messenger at the telegraph office. It's just a classic example of looking at the future through the incredibly narrow lens of the present.
And that brings us right to our central question. Why do we try to predict the future of technology in the first place? When we look back at the historical record, a really clear pattern emerges. We don't just predict to estimate data rates or future hardware sales. We predict to project our deepest social anxieties and our absolute highest hopes. When a new piece of tech arrives, people rave about its positive aspects, things like furthering democracy or fostering world peace. And they completely rant about the negatives, like increased crime or the decline of traditional skills. So predicting the future of tech is really just us trying to make sense of ourselves and the kind of society we actually want to live in. To really illustrate this, let's jump back to the late 19th century. In 1891, AT&T's chief engineer, John J. Carty, confidently predicted that the telephone would lead to a common language, joining all people into one brotherhood, proclaiming peace on earth, right? That was the high hope. But the immediate reality on the ground was a profound, deeply felt anxiety over privacy. In the early days, you often had to go to a local general store just to use a public phone. And even when phones finally made it into homes, they were usually on what were called party lines, where multiple families literally shared a single connection. Anyone could just pick up the receiver and eavesdrop on your conversation. Plus, the switchboard operators who manually connected the calls were notorious for listening in. So the technology definitely brought us closer, for sure, but it also immediately challenged our domestic privacy in ways no one was quite prepared for.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how eerily accurate some of these early forecasts could be when innovators just let their imaginations run wild. Take 1912, for example. A writer named S.C. Gilfillan wrote an article predicting that two mechanical contrivances, talking motion pictures and an electric vision apparatus equipped with a telephone, would completely revolutionize entertainment. He basically predicted video calls and the modern home theater decades before they became a reality. He somehow saw past the bulky, primitive hardware of his time and correctly envisioned a future where multimedia would be cheap enough to sit right in every single home.
Eventually, of course, the quest for connection untethered us from the wall entirely. And this brings us into the mobile era, starting with 1G, or the first generation of mobile networks. The brilliant innovation here wasn't just the wireless transmission itself, it was the whole concept of the cellular network. Engineers realized they could divide service areas into smaller cells, with each one served by a low-power transmitter. It's like a giant puzzle, and this allowed them to reuse frequencies and vastly increase network capacity. The rollout happened incredibly fast. NTT launched the first commercial network in Japan in 1979. The Nordic countries rolled out the NMT standard featuring international roaming in 1981, and by 1983, the US saw its very first 1G network light up in Chicago.
But the real turning point for how we communicate every single day happened a little later and honestly, almost entirely by accident. I want to emphasize this specific year, 1992. The mobile networks were transitioning to digital 2G, which brought higher capacity and better encryption. But more importantly, on December 3rd of that year, a 22-year-old British software engineer named Neil Papworth sat down at a standard desktop computer and literally made history.
Papworth typed out just two words, Merry Christmas, and he sent them to a Vodafone executive across town. This was the very first short message service, or SMS, ever transmitted. But what makes this micro-level human element so fascinating is that the executive who received it couldn't even reply. He was holding an Orbitel 901, which was a state-of-the-art phone that weighed over 4 pounds, basically the size of a small handbag. It had a numeric keypad and could receive texts, but the software and hardware to actually type and send a text back simply didn't exist in mobile phones at that time.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the most monumental shifts are rarely the ones we predict. SMS was originally designed as just a simple fallback feature built into the digital network standard. Literally no one forecasted that teenagers and business people alike would adopt it to the point of absolute obsession. Yet, fast forward to 2011, and the annual SMS volume in the United States alone peaked at an astonishing 2.4 trillion messages. Even today, that simple protocol continues to carry billions of messages globally. It just goes to show that sometimes the simplest, most unpredicted ideas are the ones that completely transform the world.
This divergence between what the experts predict and what actually happens on the ground is incredibly stark when we zoom out and look globally. In the developed world, we slowly transition from telegraphs to landlines and then eventually over to mobile phones. But developing nations completely shattered those predicted timelines. In places with unreliable infrastructure or bad roads, they didn't wait decades to lay copper wire in the ground. Instead, they engaged in what's called mobile leapfrogging. They skipped landlines entirely and immediately adopted mobile phones to check market prices, get the daily news, and connect to vital services instantly.
In the most profound, unforeseen surprise of all this mobile leapfrogging was financial. Enter M-Pesa, which launched in Kenya. Consider that globally, over 2 billion people are trapped in poverty partly just because they lack good financial options. They can't easily save, borrow, or manage volatile daily incomes. Storing your wealth in physical assets like grain or livestock is hugely risky if a drought hits. And local moneylenders often charge totally exorbitant rates. M-Pesa changed the entire game by allowing anyone with a basic cell phone to transfer money securely and inexpensively, using simple text menus. The socioeconomic impacts of this were profound, and they were entirely absent from early telecom predictions. M-Pesa allowed for instant transfers. Researchers quickly noticed that it changed the very nature of family remittances. Urban migrants started sending smaller but much more frequent amounts of money back to their rural families. It enabled small microenterprises to expand because money was suddenly circulating so much faster. Ultimately, it gave people a reliable way to manage risk, allowing them to essentially push excess money from a good day to tomorrow and pull tomorrow's money to fund a desperately needed expense today.
So the crucial point is that humans creatively adapt technology to solve their own unique anxieties. Researchers surveying M-Pesa users found that a lot of them were keeping balances on their phones not strictly as traditional savings, but for physical safety. As one Kenyan user brilliantly put it, you can walk with the money and you don't have it. This behavioral adaptation, using a telecom network as a digital shield against physical theft while traveling, was something the original engineers of cellular networks could never, ever have predicted.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our current moment. We've seen how past predictions either fell totally short or wildly succeeded, but none of that has stopped us from trying to map out tomorrow. In fact, we are doing it right now and with more structure than ever before. We are currently engineering the next great prophecy, the world of 6G, targeted for the 2030s.
Today, we're engineering the 6G ecosystem, and we're integrating some genuinely mind-bending realities into a single network. We're talking about native artificial intelligence, reconfigurable intelligent surfaces, ambient backscatter communications, and even quantum communications for enhanced security. It's a vision where we aren't just communicating through our devices, but where we're seamlessly interacting with terrestrial base stations, drones, and entire satellite networks all at the exact same time.
The specific technological advances forecasted here are truly awe-inspiring. We are talking about ultra-high speeds reaching terabits per second. This kind of zero-latency, highly reliable network is predicted to enable real-time remote surgeries, meaning top specialists could operate on patients in underdeveloped regions from half a world away. It anticipates a massive paradigm shift in industrial production through AI-driven automation, and crucially, energy-efficient architectures that will create climate-resilient networks to support eco-friendly urban development.
But why do global organizations spend so much time mapping out these incredibly detailed frameworks, like the IMT 2030 Trends Framework? Well, because predicting the future provides innovators with a vital roadmap. Notice what's right at the core here: societal goals. The frameworks explicitly mandate that 6G must bridge the digital divide, ensuring everyone has access to essential wireless services, and drive sustainable development.
acting as a green network that actively reduces carbon emissions. By stating these predictions as concrete goals, the industry is trying to ensure a sustainable return on investment that actually brings real value to society.
When you put it all together, it's absolutely amazing how our modern 6G frameworks perfectly mirror those 1870s telephone predictions. Whether it was John Carty hoping the telephone would bring peace on Earth way back in 1891, or modern engineers designing 6G to provide global digital equity and climate resilience today, the core motivation remains exactly the same. The technology itself changes from copper wires to terabit quantum frequencies, sure, but we are still fundamentally trying to build a better, more connected, and more equitable society. We predict the future to guide our hands as we build it.
Which leaves us with one final thought. Knowing that our technological forecasts are essentially a mirror reflecting our deepest social anxieties and our absolute greatest human hopes, what is your prediction for the digital future? How will your own hopes shape the next generation of human connection? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you looking at your devices and the invisible networks connecting them in a whole new light.